Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to IGCSE Success, your one-stop shop for everything IGCSE English. First of all, I hope you all had a lovely Christmas, and by the time I've uploaded this, a exciting start to 2025. I can't believe another year has just flown by. But needless to say, I'm really excited for a new year. There's lots of exciting things I've got planned in my life and indeed for this channel. So today's video is another one for all of my IGCSE literature students watching, and it's the second of 15 poems that I will be covering on this channel. And we're not doing them in any particular order, but this poem today, it's called Grief, and it's definitely a profoundly moving piece and probably one of my favourite poems from the anthology. Now, Grief tells the story of a boy named Grief, a self-imposed identity whose life is unfortunately shaped by sorrow, crime and neglect. It also explores urban struggles where violence and loss are ubiquitous and individuals like Grief are reduced to mere headlines in newspapers. Now, this poem carefully positions us as the readers to challenge and confront inequality, media stereotypes and societal failures, portraying grief as both a symbol of resilience and a tragic reminder of those who we are often guilty of overlooking. So let's begin reading Grief and unpicking the poem Grief by Kayo Chingonyi. Just an overview of the paper again. This video is specifically for paper 1, the poetry and prose paper for IGCSE literature. You will be looking at 15 poems. This is the second poem that we've looked at out of the 15. You'll get a choice of 2 poems, and then you have to write a critical analysis, an essay based on the poem that I guess in many ways you feel most confident with. So let's read the poem. What became of the boy who called himself Grief? The boy who, the story ran, harboured a gun through the back roads and alleyways of his teens. The boy who turned up as a footnote the night we played My Ends Are Rougher Than Your Ends in a flat overlooking London Road, front line of a postcode war. So far removed, we chuckled when someone said kebab from the shop that wore a fresh batch of memorial flowers were to die for. Grief was grit, to lend the fable texture. We never knew the name his mum called him, or what reduced him to plying the night trade so white kids could say they bun high grade. He is a boy caught between commas in a news report about youth crime, an image fixed in place by someone else's language. So the annotations, I do strongly recommend, if you've got a printer, print off this poem and annotate with me. So first of all, I want to draw your attention to the form of the poem. It's a 3-verse poem, and this definitely captures the, I guess in many ways, the chaotic and complex nature of urban life, which is unfortunately often marked by crime. The 3-verse nature of the poem, for me anyway, definitely feels intentional. The lack of structure arguably mirrors this sort of chaos and unpredictability of urban life and a world that is shaped by crime, grit and disorder. It's as if the poem is saying, this is reality, this is messy, and this is unfiltered. And the next thing I want you to focus on is that opening rhetorical question. What became of the boy who called himself Grief? So it's immediately striking. This boy called Grief is immediately dehumanized, and it's clear that he's caught in cycles of crime and poverty. And straight away as readers, we are carefully positioned to sympathize. Now, this isn't just a simple question about a boy, it's about vulnerability, especially in youth. The name Grief alone speaks volumes. It's loaded with pain, loss, and everything that innocence can't protect you from. Equally as important with that rhetorical question as well, it pushes us as the readers to really think beyond the individual. It's about cycles of crime, poverty, and ultimately systematic failure. And this poem doesn't give us easy answers. It challenges us in a rather uncomfortable way to look at the bigger picture. Now that third line, the boy who the story ran. Grief was well known. Well known for what? Well known for being caught in this cycle of crime and poverty and neglect maybe. Are these rumours, stories? Is this hearsay? Is this sensationalism? There's certainly this palpable tension in the way that grief is remembered. His life becomes this story shaped, as I've said before, by perhaps hearsay, and it's distorted by sensationalism, it would appear. It's arguably a reminder of how easily the truth gets lost when, I guess in many ways, people's lives are turned into narratives for public consumption. Now that fourth line, this boy in question, grief, he harboured a gun. Why? There's certainly this suggestion, for whatever reason, that grief turned to criminal activity. Even knowing this, we still sympathise. It's not just about the physical act of carrying a weapon or concealing this weapon. It's about what it says about survival in a harsh world, particularly for this young boy, grief. It's as though, in many ways, sorrow turns into something tangible, something rather dangerous. Now, I want to draw your attention to this rather striking metaphor. The boy who turned up as a footnote the night we played My Ends Are Rougher Than Your Ends. That metaphor turned up as a footnote, okay? Here grief is reduced to a mere small note at the bottom of a newspaper. This is often easily overlooked. And again, the wider message is that society often marginalizes people like grief. They are completely dehumanized. They are stripped of any value and worth. So indeed, this is a really sharp critique, and it's something that you would definitely want to explore in your critical analysis. It really is about how, as mentioned, how society marginalizes people like grief. Society often, again, we're guilty of pushing people like grief to the edges of awareness. He is reduced to a statistic, a minor detail in a much larger story. So what follows is certainly a comparison of neighbourhood toughness and hardship, a means, if you like, to assert authority. The urban setting in question is vividly described. We've got that metaphor, front line of a postcode war. Again, hinting towards this rivalry. It's intense, it's dangerous, particularly where these sort of conflicts between the neighbourhoods are concerned. This is not just a backdrop, guys. It's a battleground, and it's relentless. It's a space filled with tension and fragility. Life here feels precarious and constantly on the edge, and people like grief clearly cannot survive, cannot navigate all of these hardships when they're on the fringes of society. Now, what follows is I guess in many ways, a shift in perspective. We chuckled when someone said that verb chuckled it almost seems misplaced. Maybe this is a coping mechanism. Maybe, I guess these are friends or acquaintances of grief. They have become completely desensitized. Maybe they are disconnected from the true gravity of grief's death. Now, the fact that they are chuckling over kebabs being to die for, this is dark humor. It's uncomfortable. Everyday pleasures, like getting food, are tainted by the presence of death and violence, and the humour in many ways makes us laugh, but then it makes us question why we're laughing. So we're put in this very uncomfortable situation. I want to focus on that short declarative. Grief was grit, okay? That monosyllabic declarative, okay? Very much characterising grief as being resilient and tough amidst all of this adversity and hardship that he is having to navigate. It's clear for everyone, including me and hopefully you guys, grief has had to endure so much. But it's clear he is not just a quote unquote bad kid. His story has layers. There's a moral weight here about urban life and youth culture and everything that is intrinsic to that way of life. And the complexity of grief's story is further underscored with the line, to lend the fable texture, okay? Grief's story is complex, it's intricate, and as mentioned before, it's full of layers. Interestingly, the poet uses that adjective, fable, okay? A fable is a moral story, perhaps suggesting that grief's story has deeper resonance. It includes lessons about urban life and youth culture, and that really is what this poem is all about, if we're thinking about the wider message. Another poignant line that follows is, we never knew the name his mum called him. Again, it's suggesting that grief was just trapped in this cycle of crime, okay? He stripped himself of his own identity. It's the identity that his friends use. He's dehumanized again. He could not escape this stigma or this bad reputation, and his identity once again is stripped away, and it's incredibly poignant. It's incredibly sad. We feel helpless. So we also find out that as well as being involved in gun crime to some extent, Grief also turns to selling drugs to what we assume are rather white privileged kids. So the line, the night trade, so white kids could say they bun high grade, okay? Grief's turn to dealing with drugs here is presented alongside a very stark juxtaposition. On one side, his reality, dehumanized, full of struggle. On the other, the privilege of those who consume what he supplies. It's a sharp reminder of inequality, guys. And towards the end, Grief is reduced to a boy caught between commas. So again, referring to these sensationalist stories that obviously have been printed about him. Okay, this hits hard. The media doesn't see him as a person. He's a headline, a story, a way to sell papers or clicks. His identity once again is stripped away. He's flattened into something consumable. And again, it's very poignant. It's very heartbreaking. I'll just read the last few lines. So, in a news report about youth crime, an image fixed in place by someone else's language. And this is the tragedy of the whole poem. Grief's identity isn't his own. It's shaped by stereotypes, rumours and external forces, by people who ultimately do not know him but decide who he is anyway. And the poem makes us sit with that discomfort and ask how often this happens in real life, which unfortunately still happens to this day. And of course, the media have an awful lot to ask for in terms of perpetuating these really harmful stereotypes. So in terms of the SMILE analysis, the acronym that I use and I know lots of teachers around the world use, it's really helpful for, I guess, when you're in that process of revising all of these poems. But essentially, SMILE stands for structure, meaning, imagery, language, and effect on the reader. And these are all the things that you kind of need to explore somewhere in your response. So let's quickly go through this. And I strongly recommend you doing this table for each of the poems. And again, it just gives you a little bit of an overview, a snapshot. It can get quite difficult when you're revising first language English and literature and all these poems and texts, etc. So in terms of the structure we've mentioned, it's free verse. This reflects the chaotic and gritty nature of urban life and the fragmented, detached perspective of the speaker. In terms of the meaning, what the poem is essentially about, it explores themes of violence, detachment, and how grief is reduced to a symbol by external narratives, stripping him of his identity, humanity, etc. There's lots of imagery throughout the poem. But that dark imagery, for example, like a fresh batch of memorial flowers, it contrasts with the trivialized phrase to die for, highlighting the desensitization to death. Language, there's lots of emotive language like grit and footnote, and these emphasize the dehumanization of grief, whilst casual phrases reflect emotional detachment. And the effect on the reader, hopefully you can see that this poem very much evokes sadness and discomfort, illustrating the emotional distance and insensitivity towards violence and death in marginalized communities. So let's take a look at a main body paragraph using the PESA structure, point, evidence, zoom in and analyze. And I've just made up this question. So the question for today's poem, Grief, is: in what way does Chingonyi poignantly portray the themes of loss and sorrow in his poem? Those key words, poignantly, loss and sorrow, are of course going to be in the main body paragraph somewhere, fingers crossed. From the opening of the poem, Chingonyi poignantly portrays the themes of loss and sorrow surrounding Grief's life and death, illustrating how he is reduced to a symbol of violence and tragedy. The speaker begins by asking what became of the boy who called himself Grief, which introduces a profound sense of loss. Chingonyi's use of the rhetorical question emphasizes that Grief's identity is defined by his pain, suggesting that his life is lost to violence and hardship. Additionally, it creates an immediate sense of sorrow, carefully positioning the reader to question the fate of someone who is so defined by his struggles. Chingonyi's choice of words, particularly the abstract noun grief, further foregrounds the overwhelming emotional weight that shapes the boy's existence. The speaker then likens grief to a boy who turned up as a footnote to emphasize the marginalization of grief's life. Chingonyi's use of the striking metaphor illustrates how grief's struggles are minimized and overshadowed by larger societal issues, treating him as an afterthought rather than a person. The phrase underscores the sorrowful reality that grief's death is barely acknowledged, reflecting the emotional detachment of those around him. Through this, the poet powerfully conveys the loss of individuality and humanity in a world where such lives are ignored or overlooked. And that's all for today, guys. As always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave your feedback below, and I will see you again very soon. Until next time, bye-bye.